Hello, friends. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Troy Sote, and this is my final presentation, Jesus Christ, a pretty iconic figure. So let's jump into it, huh? So the objective or the thesis of my whole presentation is to explore the cultural different influences surrounding the pre-Constantinian, so that is from 0 AD until 313 AD. The pre-Constantinian Church, the degree to which those influences actually impacted Christian artwork, and determine whether this information may be used in building a case for either iconography or iconoclasm in the Christian tradition. So iconography is the worship through images, and iconoclasm is the destruction of sacred images with like an emphasis in worshiping nothing, like not worshiping images at all. Another word for that is aniconic. There it is, and I'll probably use that throughout. So let's keep going. All right, in the background. So we are going to talk about social background and the religious heritage of Christianity. So you have the Roman occupation, and you have the Greek thought that comes with that. And so we'll talk about all that. And then we have Judaism and Jesus' claim that he is the fulfillment of ancient Jewish scriptures. And the New Testament is an expression of this idea. And so a natural place to start would be to say, if this whole thing is about Jesus, what is the earliest image of Jesus, and what can that tell us about the early church, if anything at all? And the answer to that is nothing. Because the earliest image of Jesus was not actually made by Christians at all, but was instead this graffiti that was found in Rome, in Palatine Hill. It means the Greek that is just kind of scattered about there translates to something like Alexamenos, worships his God, and it has a ton of misspellings, which isn't important. But you'll notice that Jesus is portrayed as a horse or a donkey or something, and this is from the Roman misconception, or from what I could read, the Roman attempt to just get under the church's skin and claim that the Christian tradition worshipped anolatry, or practiced anolatry, which is the worship of an ox or a donkey or an ass, whatever. And then you see the Roman guard, who was probably Alexamenos. He was probably a Christian soldier working for Rome, and you can tell this because of the arm that's kind of up in the air. All right, and so that tells us a lot about Rome, and so let's start there. Socially speaking, Rome had always been concerned with conquest and expansion. Those are the two things that you see throughout the whole Roman Empire. The heritage of the empire can be traced back as far as 500 AD, or BC rather, but they really only get the machine rolling in 300 BC when they invent coinage. And you can see some of that on the left-hand side there. And just a really quick note, one of the best comparisons I could draw about early Rome was our America's own manifest destiny kind of era. And so this was the idea that Americans had this, American immigrants had this superiority and like this modern flair, and that it was their destiny, and that they were predestined by God to go and expand through all the land, but at the sake of all of this natural habitat, and at the sake of the indigenous peoples here in America. And they justified that by saying it was God who ordained it, and that's exactly what Rome did. So Rome had religion in Rome is a fascinating thing. Religion was controlled by the state, and so the emperor or whoever was in charge instituted what religions were and were not to be worshipped. Which is why Christianity was often so persecuted, was because of they didn't know how to categorize it. And so it was just kind of up in the air. But listening closely to all these religions gave them another advantage. they could take the religions they like and use them as state gods, which you can see is happening in photo 6. This is Ceres. She is the goddess of wheat and fertility, and she was instituted by the Roman emperor at a time of great famine. There it is, great famine and starvation in the land, and she was pretty heavily worshipped. And then on the left there, you'll see there really was a transition from the Etruscan-style temples to the Greek-style temples because it was seen as cleaner, and it was seen as just more modern and less mean. I don't know, lack of a better term. Let's keep going. So with Judaism, there are people who listen. And so constantly throughout, there is just tons and tons of literature throughout the Old Testament, throughout the Jewish scriptures, that emphasize listening to God and not being distracted by idolatry. And so what you see on the right-hand side of your screen is the Shema, which translates to listen. And the prayer instructs the Israelite people to worship every morning, noon, and night. And that's something they have been praying for thousands of years, literally since these words were penned. And so we'll move on. But that doesn't mean that they didn't have craft tradition. So aside from things they were selling in the temple square of the temple, obviously, they also constructed incredible things like the temple. The temple itself, like I said, or maybe didn't say this time, the temple was seen as an icon at one point, and God warned them to stop worshiping the temple and to worship Him instead. And so the temple is one of their maybe biggest craft traditions. And then moving on is the rewriting of the Torah itself. The Torah is being the first 5 books of the Old Testament. And so it was this really lengthy process to even become a scribe to do this sort of thing. And so when you got to this point, you were given a really, really, really long roll of paper, and you were instructed to rewrite or copy the whole Torah on this long scroll. And these Torahs are called Seder. Let's see. You know what? Don't really remember what they're called. But the point is, there are these really ornate Torahs that were used specifically in synagogues, and they were encased in these beautiful wooden boxes that were ornately laid with gold and kind of allegorical paintings and such. So then let's move on to the Christian tradition. We're left then with 2 ideas from Christianity regarding both the Roman Empire and Judaism's influence. First, Rome did not like Christianity, and the tradition that Christianity came from was aniconic. It was actually not surprising that we don't see very many depictions of Christ then from the earliest church, apart from those burial caves and homes. What we do find are a lot of what is in front of you, signs and symbols. So let's start with symbols, focusing on image 13 and 15 for a second and ignoring the one in the middle. Not overtly Christian, these both stem from the Greek alphabet, which the Old Testament was written in. The first one, 13, is the key rho, and it is the overlaying of the 2 alphabet letters, key and rho. Key making a k sound, and rho making an r sound, and the word Christ began with these 2 letters in Greek, and that's actually where we get our root word Christ is Christos. And then 15 is Alpha and Omega, which is the beginning letter and the end letter of the Greek alphabet. And this is important because Christ himself says in Revelation chapter 22, verse 13, that he is the Alpha and Omega. And this is important because in Greek, Alpha and Omega, like I said, are the beginning and the end, but also it connotates a noun that is a masculine and a noun that is a feminine. So he's like, what he's doing is just insane, or what he's saying is insane. So that takes us then to the Seder square. Perhaps it's the most controversial, but also the most awesome of the group. The Seder square first is written in Latin, not Greek, so every letter that you see is pronounced as you see it. But when interpreted, Christian tradition uses Greek thought. The Seder square is a 5-line by 5-column acrostic poem whose direct meaning can literally be obtained by reading any direction horizontally or vertically. It reads, "The sower with his eye on the plow holds its wheels with care." But it gets interesting because the letters can be paired off in a ridiculous number of ways. It's kind of a puzzle. Yeah, and now with no key surviving to interpret it, as it was mostly a cult symbol, the best assumption of the Seder square is actually of Jewish creation, which in my opinion is even cooler when you look at that translation. And it was eventually adapted by Christians. And I should say, image 16 is the way you can manipulate the letters for the Christian meaning, and that is pater noster, vertically and horizontally, and then alpha and omega, which we talked about earlier, at the beginning and the end of each line. Okay, let's move on. So then the other Christian sign is the ichthys fish. It's not your grandma's bumper sticker. The cool thing about this, well, there are many cool things, and so I guess that's what we'll chat about. The first one is the line of symmetry that can be drawn through the middle of the fish, and it symbolizes the unity of Christ's full divinity and full manhood meeting together. And then ichthys is an acronym actually containing the first letters of the words necessary to form the sentence below. And that sentence is Jesus Christ, the Savior, Son of God. And then the crazy thing is that acronym ichthys is actually the Greek word for fish, which is where the symbol comes from. And the last thing regarding this is that it was used as like a salutation or like a greeting to another Christian. So like you would draw it in the sand with your foot, and if the person understood the greeting, that you would invite them into your home, and if they didn't, then, well, you just kind of look like a weirdo doodling in the sand. So that's cool. So let's move on. Let's go back. So what does this mean? What does all of this mean? It's time to make a decision about the legitimacy behind an argument for or against iconography. In Christianity, like those in the Byzantine or Reformation era, based off of the earliest church history. And the short answer is that I don't think you can. Clearly, based on hidden narratives found in burial caves and in home, they were okay with the idea of imagery, but these hidden images are far from common, even in places where they'd be expected. Similarly, the slightest public display of Christian beliefs would get you injured or killed, if not by the government, then by the people who were informed by the government. Sometimes, finally, as Paul often writes in his later part of the New Testament, I think these churches were just young, and without a larger governing body like the church has had since Constantine, they were trying to figure out their own role yet in the world, and oftentimes that meant a spectrum of backgrounds and colorful solutions to problems that followed each of them. So it's hard to conceive that they'd have setting precedences for future generations on the forefront of their mind. With that, that's all I have. I'm almost out of time, so thanks for listening, and be sure to email me if you have any questions or comments. So, all right, adios, friends.